For 3 winters, an old German shepherd sat by the last train in Silverpine Junction. Not for food, not for shelter, but for the man he still believed would come home. When former Navy SEAL Warren Pike finally stepped off that train, he found loyalty waiting in the snow. But Atlas had not only been abandoned by Warren's unfaithful wife, he had also been guarding the road back to a forgotten distillery, a father's buried dream, and a town almost sold piece by piece. This is a story about the love that waits, the truth that hurts, and the home we sometimes find only after losing everything. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The last train to Silverpine Junction arrived as if it were ashamed to disturb the snow. It came slowly through the black pines, its headlight cutting a pale tunnel through the falling white, its iron wheels groaning over rails half buried in frost. Above the station, the late winter sky held a strange brightness. Not moonlight exactly, but the silver glow that sometimes comes before a storm decides whether to bless a town or bury it. Warren Pike stood near the door of the final passenger car with one hand gripping the strap of his old duffel bag. He had spent years stepping out of aircraft, armored trucks, transport boats, and military hospitals with the same controlled expression. At 49, his body still remembered discipline before comfort. He stood 6 feet tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing an olive-drab combat shirt under a dark winter coat, the camouflage sleeves visible at the wrists, where the fabric bunched near his gloves. The horizontal bands around the upper arms had faded from use, but not enough to hide what the shirt had once belonged to. A soldier's shirt, a soldier's posture, a man trying very hard not to look like he was coming home broken. The train hissed to a stop. Silverpine Junction waited outside the window, smaller than memory and sharper than regret. The station was little more than a low wooden building with a slanted roof, 3 yellow lamps, a freight shed, and a platform glazed with old ice. Beyond it, Main Street dipped between snow-covered storefronts, and farther still, the black shoulders of the Montana pines rose like silent witnesses. Warren did not move at first. 5 years ago, he had left from this same platform. Marla had stood near the bench in her cream coat, arms folded against the cold, her face arranged into the kind of sadness that looked better from a distance. Beside her, Atlas had sat perfectly still, a young German shepherd then, proud and black-backed, his amber eyes following Warren with such absolute trust that Warren had nearly stepped off the train before it pulled away. He remembered pressing his palm to the window. Atlas had risen, ears sharp, tail stiff. The train had begun to move. Marla had waved. Atlas had not. Dogs did not waste gestures. He had only watched, and watched, and watched until the last car slipped behind the snow. That image had followed Warren into barracks, into desert heat, into sleepless rooms where fluorescent lights buzzed above men who pretended pain was just another form of weather. For years, when everything else in his life became uncertain, he had believed one thing remained untouched. Atlas was safe. That lie had been kinder than the truth, which was probably why Marla had chosen it. Warren stepped down onto the platform. Cold rushed through him at once. Not the clean cold of open mountains, but station cold, metal, old wood, diesel, and snow packed down by decades of departures. His boots crunched softly. The train behind him breathed steam into the lamps. No one else got off. Of course, no one else got off. Silverpine was not a place people arrived at unless something had gone wrong or unless they had run out of road elsewhere. The conductor leaned out from the steps and gave him a polite nod. "Evening?" Warren nodded back. His voice felt too heavy to use. He adjusted the duffel over his shoulder and took 3 steps toward the station building. That was when he saw the bench. The same bench. Its green paint had peeled more since he'd last seen it. Snow gathered along the backrest and in the cracks of the wooden seat. Beside it stood an old trash can, a crooked timetable board, and a metal post where a station sign swung slightly in the wind. And near the bench, facing the rails, sat a dog. Warren stopped so sharply that the duffel slid from his shoulder and struck the platform with a dull thud. The German shepherd was thinner than he should have been, much thinner. The black saddle of his coat had dulled with age and weather, and the golden tan along his chest looked rough, clumped in places where snow had melted and frozen again. His muzzle had gone almost white. His right ear bore a small tear along the edge and bent slightly at the tip, while the left still stood proud. One of his hind legs rested awkwardly as if long winters had taught it pain, and the leg had never fully forgotten. But the posture, God help him, the posture was the same, straight-backed, still, watching the rails like a sentry who had never been relieved. Warren could not breathe. The train bell clanged once behind him. Steam rolled over the platform. The sound should have startled the dog, but it didn't. The shepherd only kept staring down the track where the train's headlight had come from, as if expecting someone else to step out of the snow. Warren opened his mouth. Nothing came. He had rehearsed this moment too many times, which was another way men ruined themselves. In some versions, Atlas ran to him. In others, Atlas was gone, and Warren stood in the station like a fool, with an old name caught in his throat. In the worst version, the version that woke him at night, he found out Atlas had died years ago behind a house Warren should have never left him in. But the dog was there, older, wounded by time, still waiting. "Atlas," Warren whispered. The shepherd's head moved, not fast, not like a young dog hearing his master. Slowly, carefully, as if hope itself had become something dangerous. His amber eyes found Warren. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The train began pulling away behind Warren, its wheels scraping and groaning, each car sliding past like another year, leaving the station. Snow swirled in the lamps. Warren stood with his hands half open at his sides, afraid to step forward, afraid not to. Atlas rose. His body trembled once with the effort. His right hind leg dragged a fraction before he corrected it. He took one step, then stopped. Warren felt the motion like a knife. "Yeah," he said, his voice breaking before he could stop it. "It's me." Atlas took another step, then another. Not running, never running. The old dog approached him with the grave dignity of a king returning judgment after a very long investigation. There was snow on his whiskers. A scar Warren did not know crossed the fur near one shoulder. Around his neck hung a cracked brown leather collar, the metal tag so worn that the letters could barely catch the light. A P. Atlas Pike. Warren dropped to one knee. That did it. The shepherd closed the last distance with a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a breath. He pressed his head into Warren's chest so hard it nearly knocked him backward. Warren wrapped both arms around him. The dog smelled of cold iron, wet fur, old smoke, and the outdoors. Not home? Not anymore. Something harsher than home, something that had survived without permission. "I'm sorry," Warren said into his fur. The words came out raw. Atlas pushed closer. "I'm sorry, boy. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know." The train slipped away into the darkness, its red tail lights shrinking between the pines. Warren held the dog until the lights vanished completely. When he finally lifted his head, his face was wet, and it was not all snow. A bell jingled somewhere behind him. The station door had opened. "Well," a woman's voice said, low and rough around the edges. I wondered how long it would take that old fool to prove he was right. Warren turned. A woman stood under the station awning with a paper grocery bag tucked against her hip. She was sturdy, silver-haired, and wrapped in a thick plum-colored parka that made her look like she had come prepared to argue with winter personally. A few loose strands had escaped from the bun at the back of her head. Her eyes were dark, sharp, and not nearly as surprised as they should have been. Warren wiped his face with the back of his glove and stood slowly. "Who are you?" "Nadine Bell," she said. "I run the market across the street, or what's left of it after tourists discovered online shopping and forgot how to buy canned beans like decent people." Atlas turned his head at her voice. His tail moved once. Not much, but enough. Nadine noticed and pointed at him. "Don't start acting polite now. Last week you stole half a ham biscuit from my back step and looked offended when I asked for rent." Warren looked down at Atlas. The dog avoided his eyes with impressive skill. For the first time in months, maybe years, Warren almost laughed. The sound never fully formed, but something in his chest loosened half an inch. Nadine stepped closer, boots crunching through the snow. Her gaze moved from Warren's military shirt to the duffel bag, then to his face. She did not ask if he was Warren Pike. People in towns like Silverpine did not need introductions when grief wore a family name. "She told you he was gone, didn't she?" Nadine said. The loosened thing in his chest tightened again. Warren's jaw set. "Marla said a family took him. Oregon." Nadine's mouth flattened. That woman would know the truth if it bit her on the wrist and handed her a receipt? Atlas gave a soft huff. Nadine glanced down. "Don't you agree with me? You're not innocent either." Warren stared at her. "How long?" Nadine's expression changed then. Not softer exactly, more careful. 3 years since she put him out, maybe a little more. Hard to say when nobody wanted to be the one to tell the whole thing straight. Warren looked back at the empty rails. 3 years. The number entered him quietly, then began breaking things. "I sent someone," he said. "A friend. He came through after the divorce papers. He said nobody knew where Atlas was." "Nobody did," Nadine replied. "Not for a while. He disappeared after Marla threw him out. Then one night Mason found him in the freight shed, half frozen, growling at a mop bucket like it owed him money." "Mason?" "Station man, nervous as a squirrel, but decent. Opens the shed during storms now." Nadine nodded toward the road. "I leave food. Gideon Rusk patched that bad leg once, though he complained loud enough to wake the dead. Folks around here did what they could." "But no one kept him." Nadine looked at Atlas. Atlas looked toward the track again. "No," she said, "no one kept him. He wouldn't be kept." The words fell between them with the snow. Warren understood before she explained. He did not want to, but he did. Atlas had not been homeless because no door opened. He had been homeless because the only door he wanted had been attached to a man who never came back. Every night, the last train. Every night, the same platform. Every night, an old dog asking the dark to return what it had taken. Warren crouched again and placed one hand against Atlas's neck. Beneath the fur, he felt the old strength still there, buried under hunger, age, and stubbornness. Atlas leaned slightly into his palm, but kept his eyes on the rails. "I came back for you," Warren said. Atlas blinked. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Dogs forgave more honestly than people. They did not pretend the wound had not happened just because the hands had returned. Nadine shifted the grocery bag in her arms. "You going to Marla's?" "No." The answer came faster than Warren expected. Nadine studied him. "I didn't come back for that house," he said. "Good," she replied. "It never liked you anyway." This time the laugh did come, small, cracked, and gone almost immediately. Warren picked up his duffel and looked toward the parking lot beyond the lamps. A single old rental truck waited there, already dusted white. "I'm going to my father's place." At that, Nadine's face went still. Silas Pike's house? Warren nodded. The name hung in the air like breath on glass. Most towns kept their dead in cemeteries. Silverpine seemed to keep Silas Pike everywhere, in the boarded windows of the old workshop, in unpaid memories, in the way people lowered their voices when his name came too close to hope. Nadine looked as if she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. "That road won't be kind tonight," she said instead. "I've driven worse." "I'm sure you have." She looked at Atlas. "But he hasn't ridden in a warm truck for a long while. Don't let him pretend he's made of iron. He's dramatic that way." Atlas ignored her with the practiced nobility of a creature who had endured many slanders. Warren opened the truck door. For a moment, Atlas only stared at the seat. It was too high for his bad leg. Warren reached to lift him, then stopped, giving the dog the dignity of choosing. Atlas tried once and failed. Warren said nothing. He simply set down the duffel, slid both arms beneath the shepherd's chest and hips, and lifted him carefully into the passenger seat. Atlas stiffened, then settled with an exhausted sigh, as if warmth itself had surprised him. Nadine stood near the platform lamp, watching. "Pike," she called. Warren turned. "If you're only here to settle accounts with ghosts, don't drag that dog through it." Warren held her gaze. "I'm here to take him home." Nadine's eyes moved past him toward the dark road leading uphill. "Then be careful what you call home." Warren closed the truck door gently. The drive out of town was slow. Snow thickened over the windshield, and the wipers dragged it aside in heavy arcs. Main Street passed in fragments, the diner with its red neon sign humming, the hardware store dark, the market window painted with fading letters. Silverpine was smaller than he remembered, but not weaker. It had the stubborn look of something that had been buried many times and kept thawing. Atlas sat beside him, silent, not asleep, watching. When the truck turned onto the hill road, the town lights fell behind them. Pines pressed close on both sides. Ahead, through the snow, the old Pike property appeared at last. The dark shape of the house on the slope, the low roof of the abandoned distillery beyond it, and the black line of the creek below, half frozen under a skin of moonlit ice. Warren slowed. His father's house looked exactly as he feared it would, still standing, still waiting. Beside him, Atlas lifted his head. The old dog's ears shifted forward. His body, tired a moment ago, grew alert. He stared not at the house, but past it, toward the dark outline of the distillery crouched under snow. Warren felt it then. Not a warning, not a memory exactly. A pull. As if the place had been quiet for years and the dog had just heard it breathe. Warren tightened his hands on the wheel. "No," he murmured, though he did not know whether he was speaking to Atlas, to the house, or to the dead man whose dream still slept behind it. Atlas did not look away. The truck climbed the final stretch of white road, carrying a man who thought he had come only to reclaim a dog, and a dog who seemed to remember that something else had been left behind. The Pike house waited on the hill like it had learned not to expect footsteps anymore. Warren drove the rental truck up the narrow road in low gear, the tires grinding through fresh snow and old ice. Pines leaned over both sides, their branches heavy and white, forming a dim tunnel that caught the headlights and threw them back in broken flashes. Down below, Silverpine Junction had already become a scatter of yellow windows and chimney smoke, small enough to fit inside a closed hand. Atlas sat in the passenger seat without sleeping. That worried Warren more than if the dog had whined. The old German shepherd kept his head lifted, ears uneven but alert, his amber eyes fixed through the windshield. Every so often, his nose twitched, catching scents Warren could not imagine beneath the cold. Pine sap, frozen creek water, old wood, maybe the ghost of a man who had once owned the hill and fought the whole town with nothing but stubbornness and copper pipes. "You remember this place," Warren said. Atlas did not look at him. "Of course you do," Warren muttered. You remember everything I tried not to. The house appeared beyond the final bend. It was smaller than Warren remembered and larger than he wanted it to be. 2 stories, cedar siding darkened by years of snow, a porch sagging slightly at the left corner, windows black and still. The roof carried a thick white load, but the chimney stood straight, proud in the way old men sometimes stood even when their knees were failing. Behind it, half hidden by the slope and the pines, sat the distillery. Warren kept his eyes on the house. Atlas stared past it. The rental truck rolled to a stop in front of the porch. For a few seconds, Warren did nothing. He had crossed oceans with less hesitation than it took him to open that truck door. The last time he had seen this house, his father was still alive. Silas Pike had stood on the porch in an old wool coat, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, the other tucked into his pocket, like he was hiding the fact that it shook. Warren had been 28 then, angry in the clean, merciless way young men are when they think disappointment gives them wisdom. "You're really leaving again?" Silas had asked. Warren had said, "You taught me how." The memory struck hard and vanished fast, like a branch snapping under snow. Atlas shifted in the passenger seat. Warren exhaled through his nose and climbed out. Cold bit into him. The kind of cold that made every sound sharper, the tick of the engine cooling, the soft scrape of Atlas's claws as Warren opened the passenger door, the distant murmur of the creek somewhere below the hill. Warren lifted the dog down carefully. Atlas tolerated it with visible offense, then shook snow from his coat as if reclaiming his dignity. "Don't look at me like that," Warren said. "You missed the step by a foot back at the station." Atlas limped toward the porch and stopped at the first stair. The house had a smell even before Warren opened the door. Cedar, dust, old ashes, a faint sweetness from mice nesting somewhere they should not have been. He found the key on the ring where he had kept it for years without admitting why. It stuck in the lock, then turned with a reluctant click. The door opened inward. The air inside was colder than outside. Warren stepped into the front room and switched on his flashlight. The beam swept over covered furniture, framed photographs turned gray under dust, a stone fireplace, and shelves still crowded with books Silas had pretended not to read. A pair of old work gloves lay on the mantel. One finger had split open at the seam. Warren stared at them longer than necessary. Atlas entered behind him, nose low, moving slowly, but with more purpose than he had shown all night. He sniffed the rug, the corner of the fireplace, the base of Silas's old chair. Then he did something that made Warren's throat tighten. The dog sat beside the chair. Not in front of the fire, not near Warren. Beside the chair, exactly where a younger dog might have sat, waiting for a man's hand to fall and scratch behind his ears. Warren looked away first. "Don't start," he said quietly. "I'm not ready to like him tonight." The house did not answer. That was the thing about houses after people died. They kept all the evidence and offered no defense. Warren got the fireplace lit after 20 minutes of stubborn work, 2 snapped matches, and 1 curse that made Atlas lift his head in mild professional concern. Heat came slowly, first as an idea, then as a small orange insistence under the blackened stone. He found an old quilt in the hall closet and laid it near the fire. Atlas ignored it. He walked to the back door. "Really?" Warren said. Atlas stood there, looking over his shoulder. "You spent 3 years freezing yourself on a train platform, and now that you've got a fire, you want a tour?" The dog gave one low breath through his nose. Warren knew that sound already. It meant the discussion had ended, and he had not won. He pulled his coat back on and opened the rear door. The backyard sloped down toward the distillery. Snow lay untouched over the ground, soft and bright beneath the clearing sky. The storm had thinned for the moment, leaving the world in that fragile winter silence that made even broken things look holy. The distillery stood beyond a line of bare shrubs. Its roof was faded red metal, patched in places where rust had chewed through. The big double doors were secured with a chain Warren recognized from childhood. The windows were filmed with frost on the inside. A wooden sign still hung above the entrance, tilted on one nail. Pike Winter's Spirits. The letters had weathered until they looked less painted than remembered. Warren stopped at the edge of the yard. He had hated that sign once, hated how Silas would stand beneath it with bright eyes and talk about water, grain, oak, and patience as if those things were sacred texts. Hated how the town had come up the hill in those early years, laughing and hopeful, bringing food, tools, scraps of money, and faith. Hated most of all how quiet everyone became after Silas closed the doors. A man could survive anger. It was disappointment that lingered like smoke in the walls. Atlas walked ahead. His limp was more visible on the uneven snow, but he did not hesitate. He moved along the side of the distillery rather than toward the front doors, nose working, tail low. Warren followed, flashlight beam cutting across stacked firewood, buried barrels, a rusted handcart, and coils of old hose frozen into place. "Front door's over here," Warren said. Atlas ignored him. "Fine, you're in charge. That went well last time." The dog stopped at the rear slope, where the hill rose against the back wall of the building. A tangle of dead vines clung to the boards. Snow had drifted high there, shaped by wind into a smooth white mound. At first, Warren saw nothing but rot, brush, and the kind of mess old properties collected when no one wanted to admit they still belonged to them. Atlas lowered his head and sniffed along the base of the slope. Then he began to paw at the snow, not frantic, not scared, slowly, deliberately, scrape by scrape. Warren watched him for a moment, irritation rising because it was easier than curiosity. "Atlas," the dog kept working. "Hey, that leg's bad enough?" Atlas scraped again. Something dull thudded beneath the snow. Warren stepped closer. He crouched and brushed away the top layer with his glove. Under the snow lay a rotted plank, then another, both half hidden beneath vines and frozen dirt. The wood had been nailed across something, not carefully. Not recently, as if someone had closed a mouth in a hurry and counted on weather to finish the job. Warren pulled one plank loose. It cracked in his hand. Behind it, his flashlight found darkness. A narrow door, low, built into the hill. Its iron handle was furred with rust. For a few seconds, Warren heard only his own breathing. He remembered being 16 and asking Silas what was behind the slope. His father had snapped at him to stay away, said the ground had shifted after the spring thaw, said no one went back there because the foundation was unsafe. Warren had believed him. No, he had resented him and believed him. That felt worse. Atlas stood beside the buried door, panting lightly, eyes bright in the flashlight beam. "You knew?" The dog looked at him as if the word "knew" was too small for what scent and memory could carry. Warren gripped the handle and pulled. It did not move. He went back to the truck for a pry bar, then returned through the snow with old anger waking in him, not the hot kind, but the colder kind that asked why a dead man still had locked rooms inside his life. It took 10 minutes of levering, kicking ice away from the threshold, and scraping rust from the latch before the door gave. It opened inward with a groan that sounded almost human. Cold, damp air breathed out from the hill. Atlas stepped forward first. Warren caught his collar. "No, I go first." Atlas gave him an offended look. "Rank has privileges." The flashlight beam slid down a set of stone steps. They descended beneath the slope, narrow and uneven, with old water stains along the walls. Warren tested the first step, then the next. The air smelled of earth, oak, metal, and something faintly sweet beneath the dust. Aging wood, old spirits, memory in liquid form. At the bottom, the space opened. Warren stood still. The underground room was larger than he expected, built into the hillside with stone walls and heavy beams blackened by time. Rows of oak barrels rested on wooden racks. Some were empty, their hoops loosened by age. Others remained sealed, marked with chalk symbols and dates. Copper tubing hung from hooks along the wall. Glass jars sat on shelves beside notebooks, waxed paper packets, and small labeled bottles filled with clear liquid. The room had not been abandoned in chaos. It had been left in the middle of a sentence. Warren moved deeper inside. Dust softened every surface, but underneath it he could see order. Silas's order. Maddening, exact, patient. On a long work table lay maps of the valley, edges curled and brittle. Blue lines traced the creek, the limestone shelves, the underground water routes Warren had heard Silas talk about until the words became family weather. Atlas came down the steps after him, more carefully this time. He did not sniff wildly. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, head slightly lowered, as if entering a chapel where he knew the dead were particular about noise. Warren found the first notebook near the maps. The cover had cracked. Inside, Silas's handwriting filled page after page. Mash ratios, barrel temperatures, seasonal water notes, grain deliveries, test batches. Not the scribbles of a dreamer losing control. The records of a man who had measured everything because he believed patience could be engineered into grace. Warren turned a page. A list of names appeared. Nadine Bell, $300 Gideon Rusk, Oak Staves and Labor Marta Quinn, Barley Credit, Owen Vale, Transport Help, Mason Dyer, Station Storage Access. More names followed. Dozens. Warren frowned. These were not debts. They were contributions, small shares, local promises, scraps of hope gathered from people who had very little to spare. Silas had not been building the distillery alone. The realization should have softened Warren. Instead, it angered him in a different way. Because if this was true, then Silas had not only failed himself, he had let everyone believe they had been foolish for trusting him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Warren said. His voice sounded strange underground. Atlas looked up. Warren almost laughed bitterly. "Not you." But in the dark, with the dog's amber eyes catching the flashlight, the distinction felt less obvious than it should have. On the last page of the notebook, tucked between two sheets of brittle paper, Warren found a loose note. The handwriting was Silas's, but slower, heavier, written by a hand that had already begun losing strength. "If Warren comes back, don't ask him to continue for me. Let the boy choose. If he still believes this town deserves it tomorrow, he'll know what to do. If he doesn't, let him go. A man should not inherit a dream like a debt." Warren read it once, then again. The word boy hit him hardest. He was 49 years old with old scars, bad sleep, a ruined marriage, and hands that had held too many weapons. Yet in that underground room, under his father's hill, he was suddenly 28 again, standing on the porch, saying cruel things because cruelty had felt easier than begging to be understood. Atlas came close and pressed his shoulder gently against Warren's leg. Not demanding, not forgiving, just there. That was worse in the best possible way. Warren folded the note carefully and set it back inside the notebook. He did not cry this time. The chapter of grief that belonged to the station had already spent itself. This was something different, quieter, heavier, less like a wound and more like a door opening onto work. "Don't get excited," he told Atlas. "I'm not saving anything tonight." Atlas sneezed. It echoed off the stone walls with such inappropriate timing that Warren stared at him. "That your expert opinion?" Atlas blinked, solemn and useless. For a moment, the underground room did not feel like a tomb. It felt like a place waiting for someone to stop arguing with ghosts and start sweeping. Warren gathered 2 notebooks, 1 map, and a small sealed bottle from the shelf. He did not open the barrels. Not yet. There were rules for things that had waited this long, even if he did not know them. He shut the underground door as best he could, but left the broken planks aside. Back in the distillery, he found the old iron stove near the wall. It took time to clear the ash, find dry kindling, and convince the flue to draw. But the first flame finally caught. A weak orange light climbed over copper, barrel wood, and dust. The building seemed to change around it, not becoming whole, but remembering the shape of warmth. Atlas lay beside Warren's boots with a groan that suggested the entire evening had been his idea, and Warren had handled it poorly. Warren sat on an overturned crate near the stove, elbows on his knees, Silas's notebook open in his hands. Outside, snow continued falling on the roof with a soft, steady whisper. He had come to Silverpine for Atlas. That had been clean. Simple. A mission with one living soul at the center of it. Now there was a house behind him, a distillery around him, a dead father's handwriting in his lap, and a list of names that made the past larger than any private anger Warren had carried into town. He looked down at Atlas. The dog's eyes were half closed, but not asleep. "You understand I'm not staying," Warren said. Atlas exhaled slowly. Warren stared into the stove. "I'm serious." The fire popped. Atlas did not move. In the glow of that little flame, surrounded by the barrels his father had left behind and the silence he had mistaken for failure, Warren Pike found himself uncertain of something he had been sure of for years. Maybe Silas had not failed. Maybe he had stopped. And maybe there was a difference terrible enough to change everything. By morning, Silverpine Junction looked almost innocent. Snow had washed the roofs clean overnight, rounding the hard edges of the town until even the boarded mill at the far end of Main Street seemed less like a wound and more like something sleeping under a blanket. Sunlight broke through thin clouds in pale strips, turning the icicles along storefront awnings into rows of small glass knives. Chimneys breathed steadily. Trucks moved slowly over packed snow. Somewhere, a church bell rang once, not for ceremony, but because old towns liked reminding themselves they still had a voice. Warren walked beside Atlas down Main Street, with Silas's notebook tucked under one arm. He had not slept much. The fire in the house had eventually warmed the front room, but warmth did not soften the questions left by the underground room. Silas's handwriting had followed Warren into the dark. So had the list of names. Nadine Bell, Gideon Rusk, Owen Vale, Mason Dyer. Not investors in the clean, polished sense. Not people with portfolios and lawyers. People who had given lumber, storage, transport, a few $100s, a few weekends, a little pride. People who had believed Silas Pike when believing cost them something. Atlas limped at Warren's side, nose lifted to the morning air. Every few storefronts, someone noticed him. A man clearing snow from the barber shop stopped mid-shovel. A woman carrying a box of bread from the diner paused near the curb. Two older men outside the hardware store leaned toward each other and fell silent. Nobody rushed over. Nobody clapped or called the dog a miracle. Silverpine did not seem like the kind of town that trusted joy quickly. But faces changed when they saw Atlas walking beside Warren instead of waiting alone by the rails. Recognition moved through the street in small, careful waves. Atlas, for his part, accepted the attention with the weary dignity of a retired judge forced to attend a parade in his own honor. "You've got a reputation," Warren said. Atlas sneezed into the snow. "That bad, huh?" The first stop was Nadine's Market. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle when Warren entered. Heat rolled over him, along with the smell of coffee, oranges, cardboard, and old wood floors. The market was narrow but stubbornly full, canned goods, flour sacks, local honey, batteries, dog food, postcards no tourist had bought in years, and a rack of knitted hats that looked handmade by someone who believed color was a moral duty. Nadine stood behind the counter, writing in a small cloth-covered notebook. She wore a navy cardigan over a cream sweater and fingerless gloves, her silver hair pinned low but already escaping around her face. She glanced up, then down at Atlas. "Well, look at you," she said, "riding in trucks now. Very fancy." Atlas walked to the end of the counter and sat. Nadine reached under the register without looking and produced a paper-wrapped biscuit. "Don't tell me you don't want it. We both know you're a liar when sausage is involved." Warren watched as Atlas took the biscuit gently from her hand. "You've fed him often," Warren said. Nadine wiped crumbs from her fingers. "Often enough to keep him judging me." "Thank you." The words came out more formal than he meant them to. Nadine gave him a quick look. "Don't make it noble. He showed up hungry. I had food. That's not sainthood. That's basic citizenship." Warren almost smiled. "Does basic citizenship include ham biscuits?" "In this town, it better." He placed Silas's notebook on the counter. Nadine's expression changed before she touched it. "Where'd you find that?" "At the distillery, under the hill." Her hand stilled. So she had known something. Not all of it, maybe, but enough for the past to have weight when it entered the room. "There's a list," Warren said. "Your name is on it." Nadine looked toward the front window, where Atlas's reflection sat beside the shelves. A lot of names were on a lot of things back then. What was he building? "A headache," she said. "Nadine." She sighed, and for the first time since Warren had met her, the sharpness in her face seemed less like armor and more like something that had been holding itself upright too long. "He wanted the distillery to belong here," she said. "Not to a bank, not to some man in a city with shoes too clean for January. Here. He called it community ownership before half of us knew what that meant. Gideon gave labor, I gave cash and storage credit, others gave grain, hauling, tools. Small things. But it wasn't small to them." "No?" Nadine tapped the notebook once with 2 fingers. "That was the trouble. Small towns can survive losing money. Losing faith gets expensive." Warren absorbed that quietly. Atlas finished the biscuit and rested his chin on the edge of the counter with shameless hope. Nadine pointed at him. "Absolutely not. You already had breakfast." Warren looked down at the dog. "Did he?" "He had mine." She narrowed her eyes. "And part of Mason's. And if Gideon has any sense, probably his too." "Sounds like he built a supply chain." "He built a racket." This time Warren laughed under his breath. The sound surprised him less than it had the night before. Nadine noticed, but had the mercy not to comment. Instead, she reached beneath the counter again and set out an old metal key with a blue tag. "Mason's on shift at the station until noon. Ask him about the freight shed. He'll twitch like a rabbit, but he'll tell you." "Tell me what?" Nadine slid the key toward him. "What it looked like," she said, "when that dog chose waiting over warmth." The station in daylight seemed less haunted and more tired. Mason Dyer was crouched beside a space heater in the ticket office, trying to repair a jammed receipt printer with the serious despair of a man negotiating with a demon. He was thin, freckled, and younger than Warren expected, with reddish-brown hair flattened under a station cap and a mustard-yellow scarf wrapped badly around his neck. When he saw Atlas, his whole face changed. "Oh," Mason said softly. "Hey, old man." Atlas limped into the office and leaned against his leg. Mason froze, one hand hovering above the dog's back as if permission mattered deeply. When Atlas did not move away, Mason scratched him behind the good ear. "Guess you found him," Mason said to Warren. "He found me first." Mason nodded, like that made more sense. "Yeah, he does that." The freight shed stood behind the station, a low building that smelled of dust, burlap, machine oil, and cold metal. Mason unlocked it and led Warren inside. Near the back, behind stacks of old crates, was a corner lined with flattened cardboard, 2 wool blankets, and a stainless steel water bowl. Warren stood looking at it. There was no tragedy staged there, no dramatic shrine, just practical kindness, worn at the edges, a place made by someone who had not known how to save a dog completely and had done the next thing available. One night the temperature dropped to 20 below, Mason said. Wind was bad. I shut him in here. Thought I was being smart. What happened? Mason pointed to the bottom of the shed door. The wood had been scratched and chewed until a narrow break showed daylight. He heard the last train. Warren stepped closer. The gouges in the door were old, deep, frantic at first glance, but when Warren lowered himself and looked carefully, he saw something else. The marks were concentrated in one place, deliberate, one line over another, the work of an animal who had not panicked blindly. Atlas had made an opening because the world had placed a wall between him and the thing he believed he was supposed to do. Warren ran his gloved fingers over the torn wood. Behind him, Atlas stood very still. That was when guilt changed shape. Until that moment, Warren had carried it like a blade pointed inward. I left him. I failed him. I believed the lie. But standing in the shed, looking at the door Atlas had broken to reach a train Warren had not been on, he understood another cruelty. Atlas had not merely been abandoned. He had been faithful in public. Every night this town had watched him walk toward hope and return without it. Warren closed his hand around the splintered edge of the door. I should have come sooner, he said. Mason did not answer quickly. When he did, his voice was careful. Maybe, but he still went to the platform last night. Warren looked back. Mason swallowed, then shrugged awkwardly. I mean, he was right eventually. It was not forgiveness. It was not comfort. But it was a small, stubborn fact, and for that reason it struck Warren harder than pity would have. From the station, Warren went to the far end of town where Gideon Rusk worked in a low shed behind his house. The sound reached the road before Warren saw him, metal against wood, a steady ringing that belonged to old tools and older patience. Gideon was shorter than Warren, but built like a barrel himself. Thick arms, square face, gray beard trimmed unevenly, a wool cap shoved low over wild hair. He wore a leather apron scarred by decades of work. In his hand was a wooden-handled hammer polished smooth from use. He looked at Warren once, then at Atlas. Well, Gideon said, dog finally got tired of raising himself. Warren decided he liked the man less than Nadine, possibly because Gideon sounded too much like the truth. He made it this far, Warren said. Dogs do that. People act amazed when loyalty survives neglect. Never know whether to laugh or throw something. Warren's jaw tightened. Gideon saw it and did not soften. You came to ask about Silas. I came to ask about the distillery. Same wound, different bandage. Inside the shed, barrel staves leaned in neat rows. The air smelled of shaved oak, smoke, glue, and coffee gone bitter on a small stove. Gideon took Silas's notebook, flipped through the pages with careful fingers, and stopped at the list of contributions. His mouth pulled tight. Haven't seen that in years. You knew about the underground room? Knew he built it? Didn't know he sealed it proper? He stopped letting me down there near the end. Why? Gideon set the notebook on the bench. Because Silas Pike was the best craftsman I ever worked with and the most aggravating man God ever made out of bone and bad communication. Warren said nothing. He had a way of making you believe, Gideon continued. Not with speeches. Speeches were too neat for him. He'd hand you a glass of water and talk about limestone for 15 minutes until somehow you were convinced that Creek could pull this town out of the grave. And people gave him money. Money, labor, grain, boards, pride. Gideon picked up a curved stave and inspected the grain. You have to understand, after the mill closed, Silverpine was hungry for a future, not starving for food. Worse, starving for a reason to stay. Warren looked at the rows of wood. What happened? Gideon's hands went still. He closed it 3 weeks before the first release, said the batch wasn't right, said the water wasn't right, said the project was done. That's all? That's all he gave us. Gideon's voice hardened, not with cruelty, but with a hurt that had aged into shape. People lost cash they didn't have. I lost 2 years of work. Nadine never said it, but she had to carry half the town on store credit that winter. Silas took all that hope, locked the doors, and stood there like a man too proud to bleed. Warren felt the old anger rise, familiar as an old uniform. Part of him wanted to defend Silas now, just because others attacked him. Another part wanted to condemn him, because that had always been easier. Instead, he asked, "Was the whiskey bad?" Gideon looked at him. "I found sealed barrels," Warren said. "Downstairs." The shed seemed to grow quieter. Gideon removed his cap, scratched the back of his head, and replaced it slowly. "You didn't open one?" "No." "Good. At least one Pike learned patience." Warren ignored that. Gideon reached for his coat. "Come on." They returned to the distillery as afternoon light turned blue across the snow. Atlas walked between them, occasionally glancing at Gideon as if to remind him that insults had limits. Gideon brought a small brass whiskey thief, clean glass vials, and a reverence he tried poorly to disguise as irritation. In the underground room, he stood among the barrels for a long time without speaking. Warren watched the old craftsman's face change in the dim flashlight glow. Not soften, not exactly, but open, the way a boarded window might open if the nail rusted through at last. "This room held temperature better than I thought," Gideon murmured. He chose one barrel marked with Silas's chalk code and a date from more than 20 years before. His hands, rough and square, moved with surprising gentleness. He drew only a small amount, enough to wet the glass, no more. The liquid caught the flashlight like dark amber. Gideon raised it to his nose. His expression altered. Warren saw it before the man spoke. "What?" Gideon took the smallest taste. His eyes closed. The silence that followed was not disappointment. It was grief discovering it had been wrong about the shape of the grave. Gideon handed the glass to Warren. "Careful." Warren tasted. Warmth opened slowly over his tongue. Smoke first, but not harsh. Then something like dark honey, toasted grain, pine air, mineral cold, and a clean winter edge that seemed impossible inside something so old. It did not taste like failure. It tasted like a man had managed, for one brief season, to trap Silverpine's winter in a barrel and teach it to forgive fire. Warren lowered the glass. Gideon stared at the barrel. "Damn you, Silas," he whispered. Not angry enough. Too wounded for that. Warren looked at him. "It wasn't bad." "No," Gideon said, voice rough. "It was beautiful." Atlas lay down near the doorway, head on his paws, watching both men as if he had been waiting for them to catch up to something obvious. Warren looked around the underground room, the maps, the barrels, the old notebook, the list of names. Silas had lied. That much was clear now. But if the whiskey was good, then the lie had not been vanity. And if the room had stayed sealed, if the records had stayed hidden, if a whole town had been allowed to believe the dream had failed, then whatever reason Silas had carried must have been heavier than pride. Gideon wiped one hand over his face and turned away from the barrel. "He let us hate him," the old man said. Warren held the glass in both hands. Outside, above them, snow slid softly from the roof and struck the ground with a muted thump. In that sound, Warren heard the first shift of something buried beginning to move. For 3 days, Warren lived with his father's notebooks spread across the kitchen table like the remains of a storm. The Pike house no longer felt empty in the same way. The fire had begun to take, the dust had been disturbed, and Atlas had claimed the rug near the stove with the solemn certainty of an old king annexing territory. Yet the silence of the house had changed. Before, it had been the silence of abandonment. Now it was the silence of things waiting to be understood. Warren did not like that kind of silence. He preferred a problem that could be measured, lifted, repaired, or broken down. A locked door, a bad engine, a dangerous man. Those things made sense. But Silas's notebooks did not behave like a clean problem. They doubled back. They contradicted the version of the past Warren had carried for years. They made his anger feel useful one moment and childish the next. Atlas lay beneath the table while Warren turned page after page. Water temperature, mineral notes, barrel rotation, snowmelt flow, limestone basin pressure, then gaps, whole pages missing. Some entries had been torn out. Others had been crossed through so hard the paper had nearly split beneath the pen. On one page, Silas had written only 3 words and then stopped. Not safe yet. Warren read those words until they seemed to turn in his hand like a key that did not know which lock it belonged to. Atlas lifted his head suddenly. "What?" Warren asked. The German shepherd pushed himself up with a quiet grunt and limped toward the hallway. His right hind leg had stiffened after the previous day's wandering, and Warren had wrapped the joint loosely with an old bandage he found in the bathroom cabinet. Atlas tolerated the wrap as if Warren had insulted his ancestors. "Where are you going?" Atlas looked back once. Warren sighed. "Of course. Why would either of us rest like sensible creatures?" He followed the dog into the distillery and down to the underground room. The morning light did not reach beneath the hill. Warren carried a lantern, and its glow moved over barrels, stone, maps, and copper like a small sun trespassing in a tomb. Atlas went straight to the far corner where a shelf leaned against the stone wall. He sniffed near the baseboard, then pawed once at the floor. "Easy," Warren said. "That leg's already filing a complaint." Atlas pawed again, softer this time. Warren crouched. Between 2 warped floorboards lay a gap no wider than a knife blade. Something pale showed beneath it. He used the edge of his pocket knife to lift the board slightly, and several brittle scraps of paper slid free, curled and dark at the edges from damp. Not enough for a miracle. Enough for a question. Warren carried the scraps back to the kitchen, where he laid them beside the notebooks and pieced together what little remained. Numbers. Dates. A partial map marking the old freight line south of the valley. A name repeated twice. Dr. Lenora Hayes. Gideon knew the name the moment Warren brought it to him. They were standing in Gideon's barrel shed, where the smell of shaved oak and smoke clung to the air. Gideon took one look at the torn scrap and made a sound in his throat that was half recognition, half complaint. "Hydrologist," he said. "Waterwoman? Came through years back?" "Worked with my father?" "Worked near him, which with Silas was about as close as anyone got." Gideon set the paper on his workbench. "She was sharper than a tack and had less patience for fools than even I do. I liked her." "That says something." "It says she knew when to shut up and measure things." Warren looked at the partial map. "Where is she now?" Gideon shrugged. "Idaho, last I heard. University work, consulting. Something with rivers and people pretending they don't poison them." Nadine found the phone number. Not immediately. She made Warren wait while she rang up 2 customers, scolded Mason for buying instant noodles again, and sold a jar of local honey to a woman who kept saying she did not believe in local honey, but bought it every week. Only after the market emptied did Nadine disappear into the back room and return with an old address book bound in cracked blue vinyl. "You have everyone's number in that thing?" Warren asked. "Only people who owe me money, gave me trouble, or might someday be useful." "That's comforting." "You're in pencil." She flipped through the pages, found a name, and copied the number onto her receipt. Then she looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Lenora Hayes won't enjoy being dragged into Pike business." "Did anyone?" "No," Nadine said. "That was the one thing your father united us on." Warren called from the porch of the old house that afternoon. Dr. Lenora Hayes answered on the 5th ring. Her voice was calm, clipped, and wary in a way that suggested she had spent decades listening to men explain water to her incorrectly. When Warren gave his name, there was a pause long enough for the wind to move across the porch and shake loose snow from the roof. "Silas's son," she said. "Yes?" "I wondered if you'd ever call." That sentence unsettled him more than surprise would have. 2 days later, Lenora arrived in Silverpine driving a mud-splattered field vehicle with Idaho plates and a roof rack full of equipment. She stepped out in front of the distillery wearing a dark green field jacket, black snow pants, and boots practical enough to shame half the town. Her black hair, threaded with silver, was tied low at the back of her neck. In one hand she carried a metal sampling case covered in old labels. She did not look at the house first. She looked at the slope, the creek line, the angle of the hill, the old transport road in the distance. Then she looked at Warren. "You have his eyes," she said. Warren had heard people say he had Silas's jaw, Silas's hands, Silas's temper, never his eyes. "I didn't know him well," Lenora continued, "but I knew what he was afraid of." Inside the underground room, Lenora moved differently than everyone else had. Nadine had entered like a person walking into a memory. Gideon like a craftsman entering a chapel he was angry at. Warren like a son trespassing in an argument with the dead. Lenora entered like a scientist entering a crime scene. She examined the maps, the old water samples, the dates, the torn notes. She did not gasp. She did not offer grand sympathy. She took photographs, checked labels, compared entries, and asked for more light. Atlas lay near the stairs, watching her with thoughtful suspicion. Lenora glanced at him. "He was here back then?" "Maybe," Warren said. "He seems to remember more than I do." "Dogs usually do. Less ego in the way." Gideon, standing nearby with arms crossed, grunted. "I still like her." Lenora spent nearly an hour with the notebooks before she spoke clearly. "There was contamination," she said. Warren felt the room contract. Gideon's arms lowered. "What kind?" Warren asked. "Industrial solvent residue. Not catastrophic in the way people imagine from movies. No glowing creek, no dead fish floating in biblical formation, but enough to make production unsafe. Enough that if he bottled anything tied to this water, he risked hurting people." Warren stared at the barrels. "The whiskey was good," Gideon said quietly. "I believe you," Lenora replied. "But good flavor does not mean safe source water at the time of production. Silas knew that." Warren looked at the maps. "From where?" Lenora tapped a faded line on the paper. "The old freight route south of the valley. There was a storage leak from transport drums. Small, badly documented, and politically inconvenient. The company folded soon after. Records scattered. Everyone blamed paperwork, weather, recession, whatever sounded cheaper than accountability." "Why didn't he tell people?" Lenora removed her glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from her pocket. The gesture bought her time, but not much comfort. "I told him to report formally," she said. "He said if the town heard the word contamination, even if the affected area was limited, Silverpine would collapse before anyone understood the nuance. Property values, tourism, loans, insurance, the distillery, everything. He decided for everyone, Warren said. Yes. The answer came without decoration. It angered him because it was fair. Lenora put her glasses back on. He also refused to produce. That matters. But he let them think he failed. He did fail, she said. Warren looked up sharply. Lenora held his gaze. Not as a distiller, not as a man who cared about clean water. He failed at trusting other people with the truth. No one spoke for a moment. Above them, faintly, snowmelt dripped somewhere along the stone. Warren thought of Silas standing before the town, telling them the batch was bad, the water was wrong, the dream was over. He imagined people leaving that hill with their shoulders bent, carrying home not only lost money, but the shame of having believed too much. He wanted a clean verdict. His father had been right. His father had been wrong. But the dead rarely gave their sons clean things. Lenora closed the notebook. The old source was eventually isolated. The freight route shut down. Limestone filtration can do extraordinary work over time, but I won't guess. We test now, properly. So they did. They went down to the creek with sample bottles, gloves, labels, and a portable meter. Warren watched Lenora work beneath a sky bright with winter sun. The creek ran black and silver between shelves of ice, quiet but not frozen through. Atlas stood near Warren's leg, nose lifted, as if he too understood that this water had once held the fate of men who never knew how to speak plainly. Lenora filled the first bottle, then another, then one from the old spring box half buried beyond the distillery wall. She labeled each one with neat, decisive handwriting. "Preliminary readings look promising," she said. "That is not the same as safe. Promising means we continue." Warren nodded. He appreciated the refusal to make hope too easy. That evening, while Lenora prepared samples for shipment, Warren returned to town for supplies and found Marla Voss waiting near Nadine's market. For a moment, the years between them folded in the ugliest possible way. Marla still looked like someone who had spent a lifetime making sure mirrors gave her good news. Her cream wool coat was fitted perfectly, her blonde hair brushed smooth under a pale hat, her boots too clean for Silverpine slush. A faint perfume reached Warren before she did, floral and expensive, absurd against the smell of diesel and snow. Atlas stopped, not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply became still. Marla's eyes flicked to the dog, and something tightened near her mouth. "Warren," she said. "Marla." The name felt unfamiliar, like a tool he no longer used. Beside her stood a man Warren recognized only from the kind of face small towns produced when ambition outgrew character. Derek Holt had neat hair, a glossy black puffer jacket, and a smile that arrived before sincerity could catch up. He held a leather folder under one arm and looked at Warren's combat shirt as if calculating whether respect or condescension would serve him better. "Derek Holt," the man said, extending a hand. "Real estate." Warren did not take it. Derek withdrew smoothly, as if he had meant to adjust his glove all along. Marla sighed. "Don't start like this." "I didn't start anything." "You never thought you did." Atlas moved then, one step forward, not growling, not baring teeth, just placing himself between Warren and Marla, his torn ear angled slightly, his old body calm but absolute. Marla looked away from him. That told Warren more than a confession would have. "You told me he was in Oregon," Warren said. Her face hardened. "I was trying to make things easier." "For who?" Derek shifted. "Maybe this isn't the place." Warren's eyes moved to him. "It isn't your sentence." Derek closed his mouth. Marla folded her arms. "You were gone, Warren. Gone for years, then half gone even when you were back on the phone. I couldn't keep living with your ghosts and your dog staring at the door like I was the intruder." "He was family." "He was your family." The words landed cold. Atlas did not move. Warren felt anger rise, but it did not come with the old heat. It came with clarity. That was worse for Marla. "Why did he keep coming to my father's property?" Warren asked. Her expression changed by a fraction. There it was, a flinch so small most people would have missed it. Warren did not. Derek recovered first. "Dogs wander, especially old ones." "He wasn't old then." Marla said nothing. Warren looked from her to Derek's folder. "You were showing people the land," Derek laughed lightly. "Warren, there has been outside interest in unused properties for years. Silverpine needs development." "North Star?" The laugh stopped. Marla's eyes sharpened. "You should sell. That place ruined your father. Don't let it ruin you too." "And you care?" "I care enough to tell you when you're making a mistake." Atlas's head turned slightly toward Warren, not pleading, not commanding, just there again, as he had been in the underground room, in the shed, at the station. A witness, a line Warren could choose not to cross. Warren looked at Marla. "You put him out because he kept going back there," he said. "Because he noticed strangers." Her silence became answer enough. "You don't understand what that property is," Derek said, his smile gone now. "It's a liability, bad access, old structures, water issues. North Star can absorb the risk." Water issues. Warren heard it. So did he, perhaps too late. Derek's mouth closed around the phrase after it escaped, but words once spoken had footprints. Warren stepped closer, and for the first time, Derek seemed to remember Warren had once made a profession out of noticing fear. "The way I see it," Warren said quietly, "Atlas waited for me longer than anyone who ever promised to stay. So you'll forgive me if I trust his judgment over yours." Marla's face flushed. Derek's grip tightened on the folder. Warren turned away before anger could ask for more. Atlas followed. Back at the distillery after dark, Lenora had pinned several maps to the work table. Gideon stood beside her, frowning at the lines as if they had insulted his family. Nadine had arrived too, uninvited, and carrying coffee because she apparently considered boundaries a city disease. Warren told them about Derek, about North Star, about the phrase water issues. Lenora's expression darkened. She took one of Silas's maps and placed it beside a newer county parcel map she had printed in town. Her finger traced the creek, the spring box, the limestone basin, the old access road, then stopped on the Pike property. "This is the control point," she said. "For what?" Nadine asked. "The easiest legal and physical access to the spring system." Gideon swore softly. Lenora tapped the map again. "If someone bought the surrounding parcels and secured rights through this slope, they wouldn't just own pretty land for cabins. They could control extraction, diversion, bottling, maybe more depending on county approvals." Warren looked at the lines. The old distillery, the buried room, the creek, the hill. The land Silas had refused to let go of even when everyone thought pride was all he had left. Warren finally understood what Hollis Crane wanted. Silverpine was not being offered rescue. It was being measured, priced, packaged. The town would not be saved. It would be purchased carefully, one tired signature at a time, until the people who had survived there became employees on land their own fathers had once walked. Atlas lay near the door, eyes open, watching the room full of humans finally catch the scent of danger. Warren placed both hands on the map. He had come back for one dog, then for one unanswered grief. Now the water beneath his father's hill had drawn a line through the heart of the town. And whether he liked it or not, Warren Pike was standing on the only piece of ground North Star could not yet buy. Warren did not sell. He did not make a speech when he decided it. He did not slam a door, threaten Derek Holt, or drive into town to throw Hollis Crane's expensive smile back in his face. He only stood in the underground room beneath the hill, one hand resting on Silas's old map, and said the words aloud so the stone walls could hear him. No? Atlas, lying near the steps with his chin on his paws, opened one amber eye. Warren looked at him. Don't look impressed. I still have no idea what I'm doing. The dog closed his eye again, as if that had been obvious from the beginning. For 2 days, nothing happened. That was the part Warren distrusted most. Silverpine remained bright under its white winter coat. The market bell jingled. Mason swept snow from the station platform with the tragic determination of a man losing a war against weather. Gideon cursed at warped oak in his barrel shed. Lenora packed water samples in insulated containers and arranged independent testing with the cool precision of someone who trusted labels more than men. Then the town began to change its tone, not openly. Silverpine did not strike with a fist first. It whispered. At the diner, 2 men stopped talking when Warren walked in with Atlas. At the hardware store, the owner hesitated before selling him new padlocks, then muttered something about liability. A woman outside the post office looked at his olive-drab combat shirt, looked at Atlas's torn ear and stiff leg, then crossed the street with the unnecessary speed of someone pretending not to be afraid. By Thursday, Warren heard the rumor clearly. He was unstable. The war had done something to him. He had come back obsessed with a dog and a dead father's failure. He wanted to reopen a dangerous distillery and drag the town into the same hole Silas Pike had left behind. Nadine told him over coffee because Nadine believed bad news should be served hot and without sugar. "People are saying you threatened Derek," she said. Warren sat at the counter of her market, a paper cup warming his hands. Atlas lay near the door, watching flakes blow across the glass. "I didn't." "I know that." "Then why say it like you're waiting for a confession?" "Because you look like a man who's considering making the rumor accurate." Warren's jaw tightened. Nadine leaned both elbows on the counter. Her cloth-covered notebook sat open beside the register, one finger holding her place as if gossip and inventory belonged to the same war. "Listen to me," she said. "Hollis Crane won't come at you like a drunk swinging a chair. He'll make other people nervous first. Then he'll make you angry. Then he'll point and say, 'See? Dangerous man.'" Warren looked toward the window. Across the street, a black SUV rolled slowly past the market, clean enough to insult every muddy truck in town. Nadine followed his gaze. "That's one of his," she said. "How do you know?" "It has the personality of a hotel lobby." Warren almost smiled. Almost? The first notice arrived that afternoon, folded in a county envelope and taped to the distillery door. Inspection required. Unsafe structure complaint. Possible improper storage of alcohol product. Warren read it twice in the snow while Atlas sniffed the bottom edge of the paper with deep contempt. The second notice came the next morning through a local attorney's office. A preliminary dispute had been filed regarding access rights, water use, and old cooperative claims that were, according to the letter, unclear, outdated, and potentially invalid. Lenora read that one at the kitchen table and made a sound of academic disgust. "They're muddying the water." Gideon, standing by the stove with his arms crossed, said, "Bad choice of words." "No," Lenora replied. "Accurate choice." Warren looked at the documents. "Can they stop me?" "For now," Lenora said. "They can slow you, confuse people, make everything look riskier than it is." Nadine, who had brought soup and then stayed because leaving before an argument ended was against her religion, tapped the table. "That's what men with money do when they can't win clean. They make mud and sell boots." Atlas rested his muzzle on Warren's knee. Warren put a hand on the dog's head without thinking. That night, the dark came early and hard. Clouds covered the moon. Snow fell in small, dry grains that rattled against the distillery windows like sand. Warren had stayed late in the underground room, photographing labels, moving notebooks into sealed boxes, and trying to organize Silas's records before lawyers and weather could ruin them both. Atlas had refused to remain in the house. "You're old, injured, and bossy," Warren told him near the stove. "Stay." Atlas had stood by the back door. Warren had pointed at the rug. That was not a suggestion. Atlas had scratched once at the door. So naturally, Atlas won. Near midnight, Warren was upstairs in the house, washing dust from his hands, when Atlas barked. Not the low warning sound Warren had heard near Marla. A hard, sharp bark. Then another. Warren turned off the tap. For one strange second, the whole house seemed to hold its breath with him. Then came the crash. Glass or metal. From the distillery. Warren moved before thought finished forming. He grabbed his flashlight from the counter, took the old side path behind the house, and ran through the snow without his coat fully zipped. Cold cut at his throat. Branches scraped his sleeves. Ahead, the distillery's rear security light flickered, then went out. Another bark split the dark. Then a yelp. That sound did what no rumor, notice, or threat had done. It tore the civilized skin off Warren Pike. He reached the distillery door and found it hanging open, one hinge bent. The new padlock snapped loose with the hasp still attached. Inside, his flashlight beam swept over chaos. A broken copper line, papers scattered from the work table, one rack shoved aside, glass sample jars smashed across the floor. A dark figure bolted through the far side door. Warren lunged after him. His boots hit spilled water. He caught himself on a barrel rack, saw movement beyond the snow-streaked window, and almost followed. He knew how. Every old skill in his body rose clean and eager. Track the footprints, close distance, use terrain, make the man regret having hands. Then he saw Atlas. The German shepherd stood near the entrance to the underground room, body low, shoulder bleeding through the golden fur. Not badly enough to drop him, but enough. Too much. His lips were drawn back, not in rage now, but pain and defiance. Warren forgot the running figure. He crossed the room and dropped beside the dog. "Atlas?" The dog's legs trembled. "Easy. Let me see." Atlas tried to move toward the door. "No." Warren's voice came too hard. He softened it with effort. "No, boy. Stay with me." The wound was a shallow cut across the shoulder, likely from broken metal or glass when Atlas had charged whoever was inside. Blood marked the fur and dotted the snow near the threshold. Warren pressed a clean cloth against it, his breathing too controlled now, too quiet. That was always the warning sign. He heard an engine in the distance, not close, not far enough. Warren stood. Atlas struggled up too and planted himself directly in Warren's path. For a moment they faced each other in the dim, wrecked room. The old soldier and the old dog, both breathing hard, both wounded in ways the other understood too well. "Move," Warren said. Atlas did not. "Atlas!" The dog's amber eyes held his. There was no command in them, no pleading, only recognition. "You know where that road goes." Warren's hand tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles hurt. Somewhere down the hill, a vehicle was leaving. Derek's truck, North Star's SUV. Some hired man. It did not matter. Warren wanted a face, a collar, a wall, something solid enough to take the force now building behind his ribs. Atlas stepped closer, limping, bleeding lightly onto the concrete, not guarding the door from an enemy, guarding Warren from himself. The realization struck harder than a blow. Warren looked down at the blood on the dog's shoulder, then at the broken copper, the scattered papers, the old barrels his father had once sealed with both hope and dread. If he drove into town tonight, if he put his hands on Derek Holt, if he became exactly the man the rumors needed him to be, Hollis Crane would not have to destroy him. Warren would hand him the weapon. Slowly, Warren lowered the flashlight. "You stubborn son of a wolf," he whispered. Atlas's tail moved once, weak but satisfied. The red and blue lights arrived 20 minutes later, muted through falling snow. Deputy Owen Vale climbed out of his cruiser with the careful heaviness of a man who had learned long ago that most disasters became worse when rushed. He was broad through the chest, a little thick around the middle, with a gray mustache and eyes that looked tired without being dull. Snow collected on the brim of his hat as he surveyed the broken door, the blood spots, the copper line, then Warren. "You touch anything?" Owen asked. Warren, crouched beside Atlas with a bandage from the first aid kit, looked up. "Yes?" Owen sighed. "Of course you did. My dog was bleeding." That would be the acceptable answer. Owen stepped inside, pulled a small black notebook from his coat, and began writing. He did not offer outrage. Warren respected that more than comfort. "You see who did it?" "Only a shape." "Vehicle?" "Heard one." "Did you chase?" Warren glanced at Atlas. "No." Owen followed the look. The deputy's expression shifted slightly when he saw the dog standing there, bandaged now, proud despite the tremor in his legs. "Smart dog," Owen said. "He thinks so." Usually the smart ones do. Over the next hour, Owen made Warren do everything slowly. Photographs of the door, photographs of the footprints before snow filled them, inventory of damaged items, written statement, separate note for Atlas's injury, a call to document the broken lock and the smashed jars. Warren hated every minute of it. He also understood, by the end, that Owen was building a fence around the truth before someone else could trample it flat. At dawn, Silverpine began arriving in pieces. Nadine came first, carrying coffee in a thermos and anger in both eyes. "I hope whoever did this steps barefoot on every tack in Montana." Gideon arrived with tools, took one look at the broken copper, and began swearing with the focus of a craftsman addressing blasphemy. Mason showed up pale and windblown, clutching his dented metal flashlight like a sword he had found in the wrong story. "I saw Derek," he blurted before anyone asked. "2 nights ago, at the station. He was with 2 men near the access road map. They were taking pictures of the hill." Owen looked at him. "You sure?" Mason swallowed. "I notice things when I'm nervous. I'm nervous a lot." Nadine patted his arm. "Useful flaw, honey." By noon, Lenora had reorganized the surviving samples and called for new containers. A retired electrician named Walt brought wire. The diner sent sandwiches no one remembered ordering. Someone from the hardware store delivered plywood and screws, then left quickly, embarrassed by his own kindness. No one gave a heroic speech. They repaired. They swept glass. They labeled boxes. They stood near Atlas one by one, not crowding him, leaving bits of sausage, warm water, a folded towel. The dog accepted the tribute like a wounded monarch with excellent manners. Warren watched them work and felt something shift again. Not forgiveness for Silas, not yet, but understanding for the thing Silas had almost built. Community did not arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrived carrying plywood and soup. That evening, Lenora spread a new set of documents across the work table. Mason's memory of Derek at the station had pushed Nadine to dig through public notices, and Owen had obtained a copy of North Star's preliminary development proposal from the county office. The language was polished enough to feel clean: renewal, sustainable tourism, seasonal employment, water feature development. Lenora put one finger under a paragraph buried on page 14. "There," she said. Warren leaned over. The clause was long, dull, and dangerous. If North Star secured key parcels surrounding the Pike Slope, it could apply for extended extraction, diversion, and commercial use rights attached to spring access and supporting infrastructure. Gideon squinted. "Say it in words for people who hate lawyers." "They don't just want cabins," Lenora said. "They want the water." Nadine's face went hard. Warren looked at the paper, then at Atlas, asleep near the stove, his bandaged shoulder rising and falling. Hollis had not broken the distillery because of old whiskey. He had broken it because Warren had refused to remain a grieving son with a dog and a suitcase. That night the town hall filled slowly under yellow lights and the smell of wet wool. Warren stood near the front with Atlas at his feet, the dog's shoulder wrapped cleanly, his torn ear lifted toward every murmur. The room held old resentments, new fear, and the stale heat of people who had spent too many winters deciding survival was safer than hope. Hollis Crane sat in the second row in a charcoal coat, silver pen in hand, his face arranged into patient concern. Warren did not look at him first. He looked at the people. Nadine by the aisle, Mason near the back, twisting his cap, Gideon with arms crossed like a barricade, Owen standing by the wall, notebook ready. Lenora beside the table, calm as a measuring instrument. Then Warren placed Silas's notebook on the table. Beside it, Lenora's sample logs. Beside those, the maps. Last, the North Star proposal. "My father made mistakes," Warren said. The room quieted faster than if he had shouted. "He decided things alone that should have belonged to everyone. He let you lose money. Worse, he let you lose trust. I won't stand here and turn him into a saint because the dead can't correct me." Gideon looked down. Nadine's eyes did not leave Warren's face. "But he didn't close that distillery because the whiskey failed." Warren placed one hand on the notebook. "He closed it because he believed the water was unsafe. And instead of telling the truth, he carried it badly. He carried it alone." A murmur moved through the room. Hollis's pen stopped turning. Warren looked at the people who had once believed in Silas Pike and paid for that belief. "I don't ask you to trust me tonight," he said. "I haven't earned that. My father lost some of it for me before I even came home." Atlas shifted at his feet, leaning against his boot. Warren took a breath. "But I will not repeat his silence." He tapped the North Star documents. "And I will not stand by while polite men buy this town's future in language so clean nobody smells the theft." The room went still. For the first time since Warren had returned to Silverpine Junction, the silence did not feel like something buried. It felt like something listening. The meeting did not heal Silverpine. By morning, Warren understood that clearly. He had stood in front of the town, placed the maps and notebooks on the table, spoken the truth his father had buried, and for one brief moment the room had seemed to listen. But listening was not the same as believing. Believing was not the same as forgiving. And forgiveness, Warren was beginning to learn, was not something a man could command just because he had finally arrived late with evidence. The next day, Silverpine split quietly. Some people nodded to him on Main Street with a new softness. Others looked away harder than before. At the diner, two old mill workers argued over coffee about whether Silas had been a coward or the only man with enough conscience to stop. At Nadine's market, someone taped a handwritten note to the door that said, "Let the past stay dead." Nadine took it down, read it once, and said, "Terrible handwriting." Then she folded it and slipped it into her apron pocket. Warren stood near the canned tomatoes, watching Atlas sniff a sack of dog food he had no intention of buying because Nadine had already declared it nutritionally suspicious. "You're keeping that?" Warren asked. "I keep records." "That wasn't a record. That was a threat." "It was written in blue marker by someone who dots their I's like a snowman. I'm not trembling yet." Warren looked out through the market window. Snow was falling lightly again, bright and slow, softening the wheel tracks along the street. "They're afraid." "Of course they are." Nadine leaned both hands on the counter. "You brought back a dead man's mistake and a rich man's scheme in the same week. Around here, that counts as poor manners." "I thought the truth would help." "It does." Her face shifted, not soft, but honest. after it hurts. That stayed with him. By noon, Warren had decided what to do, though the decision did not feel like strategy. It felt like surrender. He would open the distillery. Not for production, not for sale, not for the romance of polished barrels and heroic speeches. He would open the doors and let people see the room beneath the hill. Let them read Silas's words. Let them stand where their hope had once been stored like grain for winter. Gideon hated the idea first, which gave Warren some confidence it might be right. People don't need to be marching down there breathing on barrels and touching things with cookie hands, Gideon grumbled, standing in the distillery with a broom in one hand and moral displeasure in the other. No touching barrels, Warren said. They'll touch. People see old wood, they touch it, it's a disease. Lenora, checking labels near the work table, said without looking up, "We can set boundaries with rope." Gideon pointed the broom at her. "You say that like rope has ever stopped curiosity." "It stops lawsuits," Deputy Owen Vale said from the doorway. He had come to check the repaired lock and, according to Nadine, to make sure Warren had not turned noble and stupid in the same afternoon. Owen's gray mustache held a few beads of melted snow, and his notebook was already in his hand. Warren looked at them all, Gideon scowling, Lenora organized, Owen cautious, Nadine standing near the stove with a covered pot no one had asked for, and Atlas stretched beside the door with his bandaged shoulder rising and falling. "I'm not asking them to agree," Warren said. "I'm asking them to see it." Gideon's expression changed by a fraction. "Your father never managed that," he said. "I know." That was all Warren said, and somehow it was enough. The open day happened on a Saturday that seemed carved from clean winter light. Snow lay bright across the hill, but the sky above Silverpine had cleared into a hard blue. Smoke curled from the distillery chimney for the first time in years, thin at first, then steadier as the old stove accepted its duty again. Warren had shoveled the path before dawn, working in silence while Atlas supervised from the porch with the tragic patience of an injured general forbidden from battle. By 10 o'clock, people began arriving. Not many at first. A woman from the post office, the hardware store owner, 2 retired mill workers who had argued at the diner and apparently decided to continue on site. Mason came wearing his station coat and mustard scarf, carrying a box of paper cups because he thought there might be a cup-related emergency. Nadine arrived with coffee, soup, and the expression of a woman daring anyone to call this a gathering. Gideon stood near the entrance to the underground room and informed every visitor in the same tone one might use at a funeral. "Touch a barrel, and I'll haunt you before I'm dead." People believed him. Lenora had pinned maps along a temporary board, the creek line, the limestone basin, old freight route, sample locations, preliminary test notes. She explained the past without melodrama. The water had once been unsafe. Silas had known. He had stopped production. He had not told them the full truth. The current samples were promising, but not a license to celebrate carelessly. The word care became heavier each time she said it. People went down in small groups. Warren did not lead them like a guide. He stood near the work table and watched as Silverpine entered the room it had been denied for more than 20 years. At first, they were quiet. Then the silence cracked. An older woman named Marta Quinn, who had once supplied barley on credit, stood before the contribution list and pressed 2 fingers to her own name. "I told my sister I was a fool," she said. No one answered. "I told her Silas Pike had made fools of all of us. She said maybe I was just mad because I wanted to believe in something. I didn't speak to her for a month." Gideon looked down at the floor. One of the retired mill workers, a thin man with a cough, stared at the barrels and shook his head. "I had $200 in it. Doesn't sound like much now." "It was much then," Nadine said. He nodded. "It was my furnace money." Warren felt that one land. He wanted to defend Silas, wanted to say the contamination mattered, the choice mattered, the risk mattered. But each time the impulse rose, he forced it down. This was not a trial where Warren represented the dead. It was a room where the living were finally allowed to speak. So he listened. Gideon was the one who surprised him. Late in the afternoon, when the light outside turned gold against the snow, Gideon stood beside the largest barrel rack and rested one work-rough hand on the railing they had set up to keep people back. Silas was good, he said. The room quieted, because Gideon Rusk rarely began sentences that way. He knew grain, he knew oak, he knew water like some men know Scripture, except he swore more than pastors recommend. A faint laugh moved through the room and left quickly. Gideon's face hardened around the next words. But his pride was bigger than this building. He thought carrying pain alone made him righteous. It didn't. It made the rest of us carry confusion. Warren looked at him. Gideon did not look back. If he had told us the truth, the old craftsman said, some of us would have hated him anyway, but at least we would have hated him honestly. That was the sentence that changed the room. Not because it solved anything, because it allowed two things to be true. Silas had protected them. Silas had hurt them. Atlas lifted his head from beside the stove, watching the humans perform the difficult trick of holding more than one truth at a time. Nadine stood longer than anyone before one particular barrel. It was marked with chalk from Silas's hand, the date faded but readable. She did not touch it. She only looked at it as if the wood might decide whether to accuse her or apologize. Warren approached slowly. "You knew there was more," he said. Nadine's mouth tightened. "I knew your father wasn't stupid. That's different from knowing why he broke everyone's heart." She reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a cloth-bound ledger, smaller than Silas's notebooks, tied with a frayed gray ribbon. Warren stared at it. "What is that? Something I wasn't ready to give you?" "Nadine, don't make that voice at me. I'm too old to be handled gently by men who look like they could move refrigerators for fun." She held the ledger against her chest for a moment longer. "Silas gave this to me before he got sick enough to stop pretending he wasn't sick. Said if anyone ever tried to sell the distillery as if it were only his, I should remember it wasn't." Warren did not reach for it. "Why didn't you give it to me earlier?" "Because I didn't know if you came back to bury him or become him." The answer had no cruelty in it. That made it harder. Nadine looked past him at the people in the room, at Gideon, at Mason, at Lenora's maps, at Atlas by the stove. "Today you let them speak," she said. "Silas never did." She handed him the ledger. The cover was worn soft from years in hiding. Inside were names, dates, contributions, signatures, agreements written in careful language, and rougher side notes. The distillery had been structured as a community cooperative, not merely a private Pike venture. It had never been properly dissolved. Lenora read over Warren's shoulder. Owen stepped closer, his notebook forgotten for once. Gideon removed his cap. Mason whispered, "Is that good?" Nadine snorted. "It's paperwork, honey." "Good is too strong a word." Lenora's eyes sharpened. "It's enough to complicate any sale." Owen nodded slowly. "Enough to pause North Star's claim until legal review." Warren looked at the ledger, then at Nadine. Outside, tires crunched in the snow. The room turned. Through the open distillery door, Hollis Crane appeared at the edge of the yard in his charcoal coat, flanked by Derek Holt and Marla Voss. Hollis looked almost mournful, which Warren suspected was expensive training. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Hollis said. "You are," Nadine replied. Marla's gaze moved from the gathered townspeople to Atlas, then quickly away. Derek held his leather folder under one arm, but his smile had lost some of its shine. Hollis stepped inside as if entering a property he already owned in his imagination. "I came because there seems to be confusion regarding authority over this land," he said. "Mrs. Voss has provided documentation suggesting prior marital interest and certain preliminary agreements that may affect Mr. Pike's unilateral decisions." Marla's face stayed composed, but her hands clasped too tightly at her waist. Warren felt the room watching him. Old instinct told him to attack the weakest point. Derek, Marla, the folder, the lie. Instead, he looked at Owen. The deputy moved forward with the slow calm of a man who had been waiting for nonsense to become official. "I'll take a look," Owen said. Derek hesitated. "This is a civil matter. And yet here you are, presenting it in a room full of witnesses after an active vandalism complaint tied to the same property." Owen held out his hand. "Folder." Derek looked at Hollis. Hollis smiled faintly. "Of course, we all want clarity." The folder changed hands. Owen reviewed the documents at the work table with Lenora and Nadine watching like two different forms of weather. Warren stood back. Atlas rose with effort and came to stand beside him. Marla's perfume drifted through the room, sweet and wrong among oak dust and iron. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Warren looked at her. "For once," he said, "I think I do." Owen tapped a page. "When was this signed?" Derek cleared his throat. "The date is there." "I see the date. I'm asking because by that date, Mrs. Voss no longer had legal authority regarding the Pike property." Owen looked at Marla, not unkindly, worse, plainly. "And this signature appears on a preliminary access consent." Marla's face drained of color. Derek began speaking too fast. "That was exploratory, non-binding, standard pre-development language." "Then you won't mind it being reviewed by the town attorney," Owen said. Hollis closed his pen. It was a small sound, silver against silver. But Warren heard defeat in the restraint, not final defeat. Men like Hollis did not collapse in one room. They retreated by inches, smiling all the way. But the ledger was on the table now. The faulty agreement was visible. The town had seen the shape of the pressure being applied. And Marla, standing in the light from the open door, no longer looked like the woman who had waved from the station years ago. She looked smaller, not because Warren hated her more, because he needed her less. That night, after Hollis and Derek left with promises of legal clarification and Marla followed without looking at Atlas, the distillery remained full of people who did not know how to leave. So Warren gave them something to do. Not celebration. Work. Under Lenora's supervision, with Owen documenting and Gideon muttering like a priest of oak and copper, they lit the old test furnace for the first proper technical run in more than 20 years. No liquor was sold. No product was declared. The permits were not magically restored. The law remained the law. But heat moved through the copper coil. Clean water ran through the repaired line. The old building clicked and sighed as metal expanded. Steam rose in a thin white breath. People stood back from it, quiet. The first fire did not roar. It gathered itself slowly, orange and steady, reflecting in the brass fittings and in the eyes of the people who had once believed here and been ashamed of it. Atlas lowered himself across Warren's boots near the open door, as if to prevent him from leaving again without filing the proper paperwork with the dog. Warren looked down. "You planning to trap me here?" Atlas closed his eyes. Nadine, standing nearby with her arms folded, said, "Looks like the only one in this town with sound management instincts." Gideon grunted. "Dog should run the cooperative." Mason nodded too seriously. "I'd vote for him." For a moment laughter rose in the distillery, not loud, not careless, but real enough to warm the rafters. Warren looked at the furnace, the ledger on the table, the maps on the wall, the people gathered in the repaired light. He understood then that he was not bringing Silas's dream back exactly as it had been. He was altering it, opening windows in it, letting other hands hold its weight. His father had tried to save Silverpine alone and called that sacrifice. Warren, with Atlas asleep across his boots and the first fire breathing through the old copper, finally saw the better way. A dream inherited like a debt could crush a man, but a dream shared might yet become a home. The end of Hollis Crane's plan did not arrive with sirens. It arrived in envelopes, meeting minutes, postponed signatures, withdrawn offers, and the slow grinding machinery of a town that had finally remembered how to say no. Lenora's final water report came first. The spring system beneath the Pike Hill tested clean under current conditions, safe enough to continue restoration planning if monitored properly, protected legally, and treated with the care old things demanded. Lenora refused to call it a miracle because she considered that bad science. Nadine called it one anyway, then told Lenora not to look so offended because even God probably appreciated documentation. The town council suspended all pending discussions with North Star Renewal Group. 3 landowners who had quietly signed early intent agreements withdrew them. Deputy Owen submitted his report on the vandalism at the distillery, along with Mason's statement about Derek Holt and the men near the station access map. The old cooperative ledger did not solve every legal problem, but it changed the shape of the fight. The Pike Distillery was no longer simply an abandoned property belonging to one tired man on a hill. It had roots, names, witnesses, a past too tangled to be bought quickly. Hollis Crane left Silverpine on a gray Tuesday afternoon. He did not rage. Men like Hollis rarely gave others the satisfaction of noise. He stood beside his black SUV in his charcoal coat, speaking softly into his phone, silver pen tucked inside his glove as if it were a ceremonial blade. When Warren passed on the opposite side of the street, with Atlas limping beside him, Hollis looked up and smiled. It was a thin smile, a sheet of ice pretending it was a window. "You may find preservation more expensive than surrender, Mr. Pike," Hollis said. Warren stopped. Atlas stopped with him. The old German shepherd did not growl. He only looked at Hollis with the steady, unimpressed gaze of an animal who had outlasted hunger, snow, betrayal, and men with clean boots. Warren said, "We'll send you a postcard." From behind him, Nadine called from the market doorway, "Make it collect." Hollis's smile thinned further. Then he got into the SUV, and North Star's clean tires rolled out of Silverpine, leaving 2 dark tracks in the slush that the next snowfall covered before morning. No one cheered. That would have made it too simple. Instead, people went back to work. The distillery still needed permits, engineers, tax review, insurance, equipment inspection, cooperative filings, safety repairs, and money no one had magically discovered under a barrel. Gideon said the copper lines needed more help than a politician's conscience. Lenora insisted on quarterly water testing and a protected management plan. Owen warned Warren that if he tried to cut corners, he would personally ticket the distillery until the paperwork cried. Warren accepted all of it. He had spent too much of his life respecting discipline only when it came with boots and orders. Now discipline arrived as forms, inspections, calendars, signatures, temperature logs, and the humble work of building something that could outlive one man's pride. Silverpine began returning in pieces. Walt, the retired electrician, came every Monday and complained the wiring had been arranged by a raccoon with ambition. Marta Quinn brought old barley receipts and then stayed to help Nadine sort cooperative names. Mason repainted the station sign on his day off, though the first attempt left the letters crooked enough that Gideon stood across the road and laughed until he coughed. The corrected sign read, "Silverpine Junction, last stop before the Pines." Mason added a tiny paw print in the corner. When Warren noticed it, Mason turned red and claimed it was for branding. Atlas sniffed the signpost and approved by not lifting his leg on it, which Nadine declared the highest form of civic endorsement. For a little while, winter loosened its fist. Snow still lay deep in the shaded parts of town, but sunlight began eating away at the edges. Roofs dripped in the afternoon. The creek below the Pike Hill murmured more loudly under its thinning ice. The air still burned the lungs in the morning, but by noon it carried a clean brightness that made even old buildings look like they were considering forgiveness. Atlas grew weaker as the town grew busier. At first, Warren pretended not to notice. The old dog still rose when Warren crossed the room, still followed him to the distillery, still settled near the door as if no board meeting, technical inspection, or stove lighting could proceed without his silent authority. But his walks grew shorter. His back legs trembled after the hill. His breathing was rougher at night. The wound from the break-in had healed. Age had not. That was the harder enemy. No man to confront, no paper to file, no door to repair, just time, walking through the house without taking off its boots. Warren began giving Atlas easier days. He set an old quilt near the stove in the house and stopped pretending it was temporary. He carried water bowls to both the distillery and the porch. He cut sausage into smaller pieces and told Atlas it was for dignified senior dining, though Atlas's expression suggested dignity had nothing to do with the matter. Sometimes, in the late mornings, Atlas would stand by the truck. Warren always knew what he wanted. "No," he would say. Atlas would look toward the road. "You're not manipulating me with silence." Atlas would continue looking. 10 minutes later, Warren would be driving down the hill toward the station, muttering about poor leadership and canine tyranny. The first time they returned to the platform after North Star left, Warren expected the old ache to come back whole. It did not. The station looked different in daylight. Smaller, yes, but kinder. The bench still wore chipped green paint. The rails still ran east and west through the pines. The freight shed still held the blankets Mason had once left for Atlas. But the place no longer felt like an altar to abandonment. It felt like a witness. Atlas walked slowly to the old bench and sat, not facing the incoming track this time, facing Warren. That simple change undid him more than the waiting ever had. Warren lowered himself beside the dog. His knees objected, as they often did when humility required bending. For a while, neither of them moved. Snowflakes drifted lazily through pale morning light, landing on Atlas's white muzzle, Warren's gloves, the old boards of the platform. "I don't know what to do without you watching me like I'm late for inspection," Warren said. Atlas blinked. "I know. I deserve that." The dog leaned his head against Warren's thigh. Warren looked down the rails. Years ago, those tracks had carried him away from everything he did not know how to love properly. Later, they had carried him back, though not soon enough to spare Atlas the winter years. He had thought returning meant undoing. Now he understood that some things did not undo. They transformed if mercy came and found enough room to work. "The distillery's going to open," he told Atlas. "Not fast, not clean, not the way my father imagined. Maybe better because of that." Atlas's ear twitched. "It won't be mine." "Not really? Not Silas's either. It'll be theirs. Ours, maybe, if I learn how not to run every time things get complicated." A train horn sounded far off. Atlas lifted his head. Warren felt his whole body tense out of old habit, expecting the dog to rise, to stare, to search the windows for a man who had finally arrived. But Atlas only listened. The horn faded through the pines. He rested his head back against Warren's leg. For the first time, the train passed through Silverpine Junction without calling the old dog to duty. Warren placed a hand on his neck. "You brought me home," he whispered. Atlas closed his eyes. Not asleep, only finished with that particular sorrow. He passed a week later. There was no storm that day, no violent wind, no dramatic sky. Morning came soft over the Pike Hill, gray-blue and gentle, with the kind of hush that made every sound seem chosen carefully. Atlas had slept beside the stove through the night. Near dawn he tried to stand and could not. Warren was awake at once. He knelt beside him, one hand under the old dog's chest, the other smoothing the fur between his ears. Atlas did not panic. That broke Warren more than fear would have. The German shepherd only looked at him with those clear amber eyes, tired now, but not confused. "All right," Warren said, though nothing was all right. His voice shook. "All right, boy, I've got you." He carried Atlas to the front room where the windows faced the slope, and beyond it, the roofline of the distillery. The old dog's body was lighter than it should have been, as if 3 winters of waiting had slowly turned strength into memory. Warren sat on the floor with Atlas in his arms. Outside, the distillery chimney breathed a faint thread of smoke. Gideon had come early to check a seal. Somewhere below the hill, the creek worked its way under thinning ice. Atlas watched the window. Warren wondered whether he saw the distillery, the station, Silas, the years, or only light. "You did enough," Warren said. The words came out in pieces. "You hear me? You did enough." Atlas's torn ear moved once. His head settled against Warren's arm. His last breath was quiet, not a surrender, a release, as if an old guardian had finally set down the keys. Warren stayed there long after the room warmed around them. When Nadine arrived with coffee and found him on the floor, she stopped in the doorway. For once, she did not speak immediately. She took off her gloves, slowly, one finger at a time, and set them on the table. Then she knelt beside them with effort and placed her hand on Atlas's head. "Well," she said, voice rough as gravel under snow, "that dog had more sense than this whole town put together." Warren wiped his face with his sleeve. "That's not saying much." "No," she said, "but he made a strong case anyway." The memorial happened 3 days later at the station. No one called it a funeral at first. People in Silverpine were cautious with big words. They said they were stopping by, or bringing something, or just paying respects, as if grief were a neighbor they did not wish to startle. By noon, half the town had gathered near the platform. Mason placed the old freight shed key on a small wooden table beside Atlas's photograph. Nadine brought the enamel bowl she had used for his food behind the market. Gideon laid down a curved piece of oak from the first barrel Silas had ever marked, sanding it smooth before coming, but refusing to admit he had done so. Lenora set a small glass vial of clean spring water beside the bowl. Owen stood with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in the way good men often did when their tenderness had no official procedure. Warren brought the cracked leather collar. The metal tag caught the thin sunlight. A P. Atlas Pike. He placed it beside the photograph and could not move for a moment. Mason had made a small sign from station wood. The letters were uneven, but careful. Atlas Pike. The dog who waited until home remembered its name. Nadine read it once and made a sound that might have been approval, grief, or a threat to anyone who criticized the penmanship. No speeches were planned. Of course, people spoke anyway. Mason told them about the night Atlas broke out of the freight shed to meet the last train. Gideon said Atlas had been the only creature in town stubborn enough to outwork Silas Pike. Lenora said loyalty, like water, found its way through stone given enough time. Nadine said Atlas was a thief, a tyrant, and a gentleman, and that anyone who disagreed could take it up with her in the parking lot. People laughed. Then many of them cried. Warren spoke last. He did not say much. He had learned that some loves were insulted by too many words. "He waited for me," Warren said, "but I think he was waiting for more than one man. He was waiting for this town to stop leaving its best parts outside in the cold." The station went very still. Warren looked toward the rails. He brought me back. Then he brought all of us back to each other. That's more than most heroes manage, and he did it without ever learning to respect personal space. Nadine nodded solemnly. His one flaw. They buried Atlas beneath the old pine beside the station, where he could face both the platform and the road leading up toward the Pike Hill. No one asked whether that made sense. It did. Weeks later, on the night of the first community firing, the distillery glowed like a lantern above Silverpine. It was not a grand opening. The permits for public sale were still in progress, and Lenora had threatened legal violence if anyone used the word finished. But the cooperative had been formally recognized for review, the water protection plan submitted, and the restored test system approved for a limited ceremonial run. Inside, people gathered beneath warm light and rafters newly cleaned of dust. The old stove burned steadily. Copper gleamed. Fresh labels marked every valve. Gideon barked instructions at volunteers who smiled because they had discovered his anger often meant affection wearing work boots. Nadine poured coffee strong enough to make several people reconsider their life choices. Mason arrived late from the station, cheeks red from cold, carrying the repainted signs left over brushes like sacred relics. Warren stood outside for a moment before going in. Snow fell softly around him. Below the hill, Silverpine's lights glowed through the trees. Farther out, the station lamps shone beside the tracks. There was no dark shape sitting by the bench now, no watchful amber eyes, no old shepherd judging the punctuality of trains and men. The absence hurt, but it did not feel empty in the old way. Behind Warren, laughter rose from inside the distillery. Someone dropped a tool. Gideon cursed. Nadine scolded. Mason apologized for something that probably was not his fault. The furnace hummed low and steady, breathing heat into copper, wood, and winter. Warren touched the old key on his chain. Then he looked toward the station one last time. Some creatures stayed until the door opened. Some stayed until the house remembered it had a hearth. Atlas had stayed until a soldier came home, a father's dream was taken out of the dark, and a town learned that hope did not have to belong to one stubborn man. It could be carried, bowl by bowl, board by board, name by name. Warren turned back to the distillery and stepped inside. The fire welcomed him without asking where he had been. Sometimes the ones who wait for us are not asking us to go back to who we were. They are quietly leading us toward who we still can become. Atlas waited at that station until Warren found more than a lost dog. He found his father's unfinished dream, a town that still had a heartbeat, and the courage to stay when leaving would have been easier. Maybe healing does not always arrive as a loud miracle. Sometimes it comes as one loyal soul, one open door, one small fire lit again in a place we thought had gone cold. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us who or what once helped you find your way home. And if you'd like more stories of loyalty, loss, and hope, please subscribe and stay with us. May peace find you gently, especially in the places where you are still learning to begin again.